Hey, look out. It's Faith Talk Live. I'm Rick Probst.
And I'm Dan Ratcliffe.
Dan and I are real excited to talk with certified life coach, Dr. Taft Quincey Heatley. He's got a new book out, and he's also the 12th senior pastor of Shiloh Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. Shiloh is a historic church in Old Town community of Alexandria, founded by former enslaved African Americans in 1863. Doc, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you guys doing today?
Doing well.
Yeah, when I read that, I do want to talk about the book. The book is called The Pandemic Pastor, and I was talking, there you go. Nice. Nice, very nice. We want to talk about that in a few. We were just talking to somebody yesterday. I was talking with Robert Morris yesterday of Gateway out in Texas, and we were talking about the post-pandemic church and the trends that he saw, but we want to talk about yours. It's very important. We have a lot of pastors that we talk to, small, medium, and mega church pastors. So I know this is going to be a great book, great topic. But I got to ask you about Shiloh Baptist Church, founded in 1863. The Civil War was still going on.
Yeah.
In Virginia.
Yes.
Of all places. But
Absolutely.
I don't know if even the word, how cool is it that you are the 12th senior pastor of this historic place? That's just awesome.
Yeah, it's a blessing. And if you look at the history of how Shiloh, became into being, so when Abraham Lincoln actually signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1963, while the Civil War was still going on, Alexandria in Virginia was considered somewhat part of Washington, D.C. So it was like the southernmost point in the Union, but also the northernmost point of the Confederacy. And so that's kind of how you had, that dynamic going on there. And of course, when the war ended in 1865, of course, it went into law over the nation. But during that time period, what you had was some African Americans who were once enslaved. They began working for the Union Army, and they actually founded the old Shiloh Society. It was 50 of them, after this law went into practice in the Union. And they got together at the La Overture Hospital, which was a hospital before for soldiers that were there. They met there and, founded the church. And, 158 years later, here we are.
Wow. And only 12 senior pastors over that time. That is amazing.
Yeah, well, it's Baptist. So no Episcopy, no business, anybody coming in making appointments. Luckily we've had some long tenure pastors. Actually, my predecessor was here 15 years, and the one that he succeeded was here for 47 years. So it was really, kind of in the 20th century where it kind of got some stability, with pastoral leadership. Yeah. And here I am 6 years in.
Wow.
That is so good. Dr. Taft Quincey Heatley, new book is called The Pandemic Pastor. He also loves empowering people to walk in their why. I love that. I love that as well. Let's talk about the book. Pastor, tell us about the book. And I usually ask why now, but that's apparent, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty apparent, and
why didn't you write it before the pandemic?
If you want to be, really be technical about it, I'm sure there's parts in the world and even parts in our country we can consider, and even in the kingdom of God, we can say we're in a pandemic.
Yeah.
But to look at this from a holistic standpoint, and when the pandemic hit, we were just so busy trying to stay afloat, trying to stay alive. And fortunately, I became pastor in 2015 through a lot of conversations and some struggle, which I talk about here in the book. The church decided to make some upgrades to our technology. And that was making sure our streaming was right, our audio visual, and really trying to be more appealing to sort of the millennial generation, knowing that, I'm 46 years old, so I'm a Generation Xer, and I grew up in church, but most of the people that I pastor who are younger than me did not. And so they just kind of think about church differently. And one of the things that was different is how they come to church. I'm the generation, somebody invites you to church, you go. This generation, they invite you to church, they go to the website, and then they look to see what the church is doing. They might do that for a year before they ever even step foot in the church.
Right. Yeah.
So I kind of figured that was some of the trends, reading Tom Rainier and some of the other things, that I read to see, okay, what could we do? And so we made those changes. And so when the pandemic hit, it wasn't too much of a culture shock for us, because we had the infrastructure in place.
Okay.
And so in 2021, I just began to write about a lot of the things that I saw, kind of the philosophies by which I had to pastor now, because, you know, as hard as it is, you're talking about pastoral care, you're talking about funerals, all these things where the church really can't be the church how we knew the church to be, because we couldn't be around one another. So what does that look like? You know, you're talking about working parents now who now have to be teachers as well, because they couldn't get into school. You know, so it was so much going on. And I really looked at it as, okay, this almost is like a church plant now. So if that's the case, I had to study the culture. Okay, so what is the culture of this organization? So, and history has been a huge part of my congregation. So understanding what the culture is before you change it. And understanding that simply many of our religious practices, we just couldn't do. What does communion look like? What does offering look like? You know, what does passing the peace look like? When, you know, and if you're by yourself in your home, you're passing the peace with yourself. You know, so all of these things where we kind of had to reframe how we considered worship. And more importantly, we had to reframe how we present Jesus in this generation. And so, and that's some of the things that I really kind of touch on, along with self-care and mental health and all these things, because it was a trying time for a lot of churches. And I'm sure, you know, many pastors, you know, saw their ministries close, saw their ministries fold.
Yep.
You know, and that took a lot of my colleagues into depression, you know, not to mention their own personal faith struggles with people in their families and their congregations who fell victim to COVID.
Yeah.
So it was a lot going on.
Now, like you mentioned, it was very hard on churches, especially during the main part of the pandemic. Did you see anything good come out of the pandemic in your church specifically, that you're like, this is a good thing that it's happened?
Well, I did. And I say this, you know, with all humility. My church is about 1,000 members. And the good thing about our church is that we did not lose anyone to COVID during this entire time.
That's awesome.
That's great.
We had a number of people infected, you know, myself included, you know, but, you know, we came back. So I think that's one good thing. But also, I thought it was an opportunity to really think about, I'll say, post-pandemic, and really examine, are our practices necessary? Because what we saw is we continued to worship God, and a lot of the things that we did from tradition, we can no longer do. So that caused me to ask the question, well, why are we doing it, and how did it come to be? So I think it made us more efficient as a ministry. Of course, you probably have heard from a lot of pastors in the year 2020, giving went up, you know, because people couldn't go anywhere to spend. So they came to church, you know, virtually, and they started giving to their churches and other charities. So that was a good thing as well. I think it really tested, you know, our faith and our beliefs and our principles and our values, to see how we continue to be the church, and even how do we evangelize now in such a time as this. And so I guess it really calls the leaders and I to really think about how we do in church. And that's not to say we weren't thinking before, but I think that sometimes when you have, you know, habits and cultures and customs that you doing for generations. I mean, I got people that have been in this church for 4 or 5 generations, you know, and so they've been doing things, you know, for a long time. Now it causes us to really to ask the question, okay, why is what we doing, is it glorifying God? That's number one. Okay. And if it's glorifying God, you know, how can we explain to people who don't know that this is glorifying God? So it calls us to get back into the word and really look and see, you know, how are we presenting Jesus again?
Doc Heatley talking about his book, The Pandemic Pastor. It's interesting why you were talking about, because you have made some really heavy shifts in the good sense. We can see that, right? Because you want to reach the millennial and beyond. How did you communicate that to those? You said you had generations of folks that have been in that church. Sometimes when you shift a bit, you ruffle a few feathers, which happens, right? But how did you, was it in messages? Did you constantly say, hey, this is, I mean, sometimes those sacred cows are sacred.
Yeah. Well, I talk about that in the book. There's a chapter where I speak about, you know, sort of, I don't want to say idols, but there are things in the church that we give divinity to. So a lot of times when we worship these things, practices, and procedures, you know, when God may have passed us on and God's over here, and we're still thinking God's, you know, over here.
Right.
So it was a combination of things. The first thing I did as a pastor, I really encouraged a lot of the stalwart, some of the pillars of our church. And I was frank with them. I told them you may need to just go ahead and begin to grieve your church, because how you know church, how you've come to understand church, it's going to be different from this point on. And the pandemic facilitated that. Crisis has a way of causing us to look differently at things.
Yeah.
And I think that have facilitated that. But I think that because of some of the structural changes that we made to our technology infrastructure helped a bit, because they saw that although the building was not occupied, the church was never closed. So they began to see what we were doing, and kind of really spawned some sense of creativity within the congregation, because we really didn't outsource a lot of our ministry and worship. For the most part, everything that we needed was in the congregation. So we had, video producers and editors, and we looked at a nice way to do worship, and mainly the seniors in the community really took a hold of this. They were the ones on their phone tuning in. We did this thing with worship, what we use a multi-track, and we actually had our choir record themselves individually singing, and we would put it all together. So, we didn't risk the chance of coming into the sanctuary. And that's how we did worship. So it would be a worship video that would come in. And then I made the decision to preach live from the sanctuary every Sunday, for the sake of the people who wanted to get some sense of being in the sanctuary as well.
Yeah.
So it was a multi-pronged approach. And I talk about it in the chapter, speaking about the sacred space in the home and what we had to do to create spaces for worship in the home, but also the necessity for virtual ministry. And interestingly enough, the church really took hold to it. And because if you wanted to worship at the church that you love, this was the only way that you could. We had laws that were against us, and I'm here, right outside Washington D.C. So we got a lot of government employees, a lot of former military, a lot of people that work for Secret Service. So and they're members of my congregation. They would tell me, "Look, Pastor, this is coming down the line. Here's what's happening." So that may have facilitated some of the changes, and maybe put them in a mindset that these were things that we needed to do.
All right. Dr. Taft Quincey Heatley, TaftQuinceyHeatley.com is the website to go to find out more about him, find out more about the book. Finally, Pastor, what are you hearing so far about the book from folks?
I'm hearing a lot of different things, man. I'm hearing people, first, some people are saying that they definitely agree with a lot of things that I'm speaking about. Some people are saying that it's kind of eye-opening because they never really considered some things. And unfortunately, some people are saying, I wish I would have known this before the pandemic.
Right.
Because I think they're seeing some of the mistakes that they made pastorally.
Yeah.
Most of the traction that I'm getting is the next to the last chapter that speaks about the importance of self-care. A lot of my colleagues across, broad spectrums are saying that they didn't realize how much they weren't taking care of themselves because they were so devoted to the ministry, that their families were suffering, their children were suffering. And so I think it helped them kind of reframe and reprioritize what is necessary. Because I try to model that families first. And I think that, in some weird way, God was trying to help, restructure that to help us to see that, look, we can pastor people all day, but if we not pastoring our wives, our husbands, and our children, they come first. And we need to put some focus in on them. So I think that the attention to the family is really what I speak about in the next to last chapter. And a lot of people say they really appreciate that.
So good. Doc Heatley's book is called The Pandemic Pastor. Pick it up. Go to TaftQuinceyHeatley.com. There it is. Nice looking book too there. Doc, if you're up for it, we'd love to catch up with you in the middle of the summer. What a delight you are. Thanks for doing what you do, and you do it so well. So again, check out the book, and hopefully we'll hear more from him soon. We'll got to take a break. We'll be right back. I'm Rick Probst.
And I'm Dan Ratcliffe.
This is Faith Talk Live.